Hey, so I wanted to give a really quick rundown on this new camera I just got. This is the Minolta TC-1. For those of you who follow the point and shoot scene know that this is a relatively luxurious camera. It doesn't go quite as high as the Contax T2 or the T3 or the Leica Minilux and so on, but it's quite premium. Um, I managed to nab this for a little bit less than the usual asking prices, mostly probably because this diopter knob is damaged and or fallen off. Um, Other minor problems I've seen so far with this camera, I can't entirely tell if a little piece of plastic is broken in there, but the film cartridge seems to fit just fine, so that's okay. Um, the foam seals might have been not that well reapplied recently, judging by some of the uh, stickers that over here, and also like the pieces of film slash foam seals that were floating around when I opened this. When I received this, it came with a roll of film already loaded, so I finished that off and will get it developed. But unfortunately, I haven't seen any actual images from this, so I don't even know if it works. But here's the thing, I really hope it works well. Mostly because I spent so much gosh darn money on it, but also because this camera is so much fun to use. I really want it to work because I really want to use this camera because it's amazing. And I'm just going to talk a little bit about why I think this is one of the best UX experiences I know so far, I've encountered so far. So at the front of the camera you have the lens and you have the aperture ring. The aperture ranges from f3.5 to f16. You'll notice it's 3.5 is relatively fast, but it's not 2.8 or the 2.4 of some really expensive point and shoots. But 3.5 is pretty standard, it's on the above average side, I'd say, and it's a fixed lens. It's a 28mm lens, which is a little bit wider than the 35 you usually see. Perfectly fine with me. I like 28 quite a bit as a focal length. And you will notice immediately that the apertures are only 3.5, 5.6, 8 and 16. There's no value in between. There's no f4, there's no f11 or f13. Perfectly fine with me because I know the camera will adjust the shutter speed to match, and I don't need that precise of an aperture value. If I want it fully open, I'll keep it at 3.5. Otherwise, 5.6 or f8. I probably will never touch f16 unless I really have to. Very simple, straightforward. The fact that you can change the aperture at all is nice, and that this is an aperture priority camera. There is no program mode on this camera. It's purely aperture priority. We'll get back to that in just a second. So on the top you have this button called AF. I'll explain that when we get to the FM mode. The shutter dial, and you have this little slider. This slider is your input selector, if you want to call it that. You can choose between the inputs using this slider. And on the back, the on-off button, spot meter, and a little light button that activates a little green light that's hard to see in this sunlight, but it's just a little light over here. It's a classic 90s Casio watch light. Here's a little diopter which is broken on mine, but thankfully I could still adjust it with my fingernails. Maybe someday I'll clean this up somehow. Maybe find a replacement part. I don't think. Maybe with a 3D printer you could print one, but whatever. Otherwise, my particular copy seems to work just fine. Okay, so in this dial, hold is the standard. You normally keep it on hold. It doesn't change any settings. And when you're on hold, you have to depress this button to switch to the next thing. And here's the first part of the genius, is that now this button no longer needs to be pressed to switch again. Only needs to be pressed when you're switching out of hold. So you can quickly cycle through your settings and then just get to hold, and now your settings are more or less locked unless you need to change them again. It's wonderful, simple design. Once you're in a mode, like say this flash setting, you can use this to select. So this is fill light, slow sync flash, or night flash as it's called in this camera. So basically it'll try and sync the flash, sync the exposure to match the ambient light. Plus it'll use the flash. So you can get shutter speed as low of 2 seconds, so you have to be a little bit careful with that, but it tries to make your scene look even. And that's just a regular flash, and then that's no flash. Switch to the next mode, and this is red eye. Red eye is only used when the flash is activated. You'll notice that if I go back to the flash mode and turn it on, now the red eye shows up. But otherwise you can turn it off here. Next is self timer. It lets you select between 2 seconds and 10 seconds, and no self timer. Then is ISO. You have full ISO control on this camera. It does use DX code reading, but you can override it with ISO, which is again a feature not all point and shoots have. As simple as it sounds, but it's very, very good to have that, especially if you like to overexpose a little bit or underexpose. And it's also useful for controlling the flash, which I'll get back to in a second. Next is the autofocus manual mode setting. So now it's on AF. Then you can cycle through manual focus distances. So the closest focus distance for this lens is 45 centimeters. And next is 50 centimeters, 55, 60, 65, and so on. And if you want to, and here's again really good UX, if you just want to return to autofocus, instead of having to scroll through all of these distances, just press the AF button. So you're out there, you have to switch to manual focus for whatever reason, take your one shot, and now you want to be back in autofocus, or quickly just tap that button and you're back in autofocus. Great. This is the exposure compensation dial. You can go negative 2.0, or you can go plus quite a bit more, plus 4 I believe. Again, very useful feature. And then you can go back to hold, and that's it. It's a very simple aperture priority camera. So with that said, there are a few caveats and quirks. The first, as I mentioned earlier, you don't have the in-between stops, but again, that doesn't matter much. The next little quirk is that it's aperture priority control, so it'll control the shutter speed for you, and there's no way of manually controlling the shutter speed, which is fine by me. I don't care. I'm perfectly content with an aperture priority on a camera like this. But there is the caveat that if the shutter speed gets too fast, I believe if it hits above an EV of 11 something, it starts using a shutter controlled aperture. So it stops it down, and it's not stopping down with this regular aperture. There's I believe there's a second aperture in the back, or an aperture with the shutter curtains or something, and it stops that down. And when it stops that down, you don't get the perfectly circular highlights in the background like you would with this very nice circular aperture. So that's just something to keep in mind. If the shutter speed is slowly blinking up here, it means that you really should step down the aperture yourself, or the camera will try and compensate on its own. Again, some people will find the loss of control a little bit annoying, but for me personally, in a point and shoot, that's just a life-saving feature to prevent extreme overexposure. And as long as you pay attention to the little shutter speed indicator in there, you should be fine. There are parallax compensation lines in here, but they don't seem to move, so you just have to judge that yourself. Again, not a huge deal. The minimum focus distance of 45 centimeters is pretty good actually for a point and shoot. I believe a lot of rangefinders are usually more like 70 centimeters, so not bad that I can get reasonably close to things. And I've heard not pretty good about the image quality and bokeh at close distances too, so hopefully that's good, but I haven't seen any images myself yet. Other caveats, in the manual it says the flash should only be used at f3.5. That could be a little bit of an issue for a lot of people. Like, I usually prefer to use flash slightly stopped down at like f5.6 or f8. One way around that is by using the ISO dial. The ISO, so if your film speed is 200 and you set the ISO to 100, the flash will be metering for 100, but you can set your aperture to say to one above, to like 5.6, and I assume that will compensate accordingly, but I haven't tried it yet. it's not a huge deal, and you know, you can use your flash at 3.5 no problem. Just keep that in mind that the camera manual recommends 3.5 for flash. Um, Other caveats: it is a 1995-ish autofocus camera, so you know, autofocus isn't going to be perfect. So always keep an eye on the distance scale at the bottom to see if it roughly matches what you'd expect. You know, if you're focusing on someone about a meter in front of you, but the distance is saying infinity or something, then you know the autofocus is misjudging. So, but in my short little experience so far, it's been pretty consistently good so far, and you can just move it around to readjust as needed. Um, and of course, you know, you've always got the option of manual focus on this camera, which is very nice to have. And this autofocus thus far has been working a lot better than it does on my Contex TVS3, which is unfortunately broken right now. The autofocus on that is busted, a real tragedy. Um, but yeah, it's a very simple camera, but it seems extremely effective. And this user design is like one of my favorites. It's just so simple and so straightforward. I love it a lot. And the greatest tragedy is that, as far as I can tell, this was the only point and shoot of this kind that Minolta released. There's no TC-2 or TC-3, and which is a shame, because I really wish some of this design ethos had carried forward to like newer cameras, to even digital cameras, because it's so compact, it's so small, it's an aperture priority. It's basically a perfect camera, except again, you know, I still have to look at the images myself, and it has caveats, but that's why you have other cameras to take care of those caveats depending on the situation. I will mention that the shutter is pretty loud, as is the film wind. The film wind is especially loud. But yeah, you know, a very nice looking camera, very sleek. I have no real complaints. I just really hope those images that I took with it end up good. It was an old roll, so God knows when, so who knows. And I'll definitely shoot another roll just to double check. I have heard that some of these have an issue with light leaks inside that are related more to the aperture, which would really suck. I really hope that if mine has an issue like that I can repair it. But you know, that's just the gambles you take. And as I mentioned, this is an automatic loading. You just put the canister here, you roll over the film into this side, and you're good to go. Okay, so that's all. Like I said, not a proper review, just a quick little rundown of why I seem to really like about this camera. Here's to hoping that I end up using it for many years. Take care. Oh, one quick thing I forgot to mention. One of the premium, I guess, features of this camera is that it actually remembers your settings. So if I change the flash setting to say on, now the flash is on, and I turn off the camera and I turn it back on, the flash is now on. So this is, a lot of cameras, point and shoots especially, tend to reset their settings every time, turn them on and off. This one, however, seems to remember, so that is wonderful. One more thing, if you want to use the spot meter, you can use it as either a keep it pressed to meter, and then you know, you take your reading by keeping it pressed, and then you just press the shutter, recompose and press the shutter button as needed, or you can use it as a toggle. So press it once, the camera sets the shutter speed, and then you can take the picture and you press it again to turn off that reading. That just depends on, like, you can configure that setting using this on-off button as well. Somehow it's mentioned in the manual. But yeah, like I said, very good UI, very easy to use. One of the cool things that I didn't have to look at the manual to figure out 90+% of how to use this camera. I will mention there's no automatic flash, so the flash is either always on or off. The camera won't decide for you. But again, for me personally, that's not a big deal at all. Let's see if I can show you the shutter.